Hi, welcome. Enjoy the content, subscribe, and turn on notifications.
Gregory had always been the kind of man who found beauty in quiet routines. At 45, he lived in San Antonio, Texas, with his wife Maureen, a woman around the same age, originally from Boston, with whom he'd shared many years of marriage. Their relationship was seen by close friends as stable, mature, and free of conflict. They didn't have children together, and that never seemed to weigh on the relationship. Both found in their life together a safe comfort zone, marked by simple gestures, mutual respect, and a rare kind of peace. Weekends were filled with light walks, coffee at local bakeries, and occasional visits to antique shops, a passion they'd shared since their honeymoon. But Gregory's past held deep scars he carried quietly. His first marriage happened when he was still young, to a woman named Caroline. They met early in life, and she already had a young son, Elliot, just 2 years old, from a previous relationship. Gregory didn't hesitate. From the beginning, he treated the boy as his own, calling him son as naturally as if biology had never mattered. Caroline died young, taken by an aggressive illness, leaving behind not just a huge void but also the responsibility of raising a grieving boy still growing up. Gregory took on that responsibility with courage. He raised Elliot with everything he could offer: love, discipline, guidance. Old photo albums held pictures of the two during moments that ranged from trips and park afternoons to nights of pizza and old movies. For years, it was just father and son facing the world together. Time passed, and Gregory eventually met Maureen through a mutual friend. Their relationship grew naturally, and it wasn't long before she became part of the household routine. Though she wasn't especially affectionate toward Elliot, she always behaved respectfully, treating the boy politely while keeping a certain distance that Gregory interpreted as caution. At 17, Elliot was selected for a cultural exchange program that took him overseas. It was a joint decision, supported by his father, who believed international experiences were important for personal growth. The boy grew up fast. His years abroad shaped him into an independent person. After finishing his studies, he decided to stay abroad for a while, working on short-term projects, learning new languages, and broadening his worldview. 5 years passed in total, with occasional emails to his father and sporadic Sunday night calls. At 22, Elliot decided to come back. He said he missed home, Texas food, the dry climate, even the porch where he used to study on spring afternoons. Gregory welcomed him with open arms, happy to have his son back under the same roof. Maureen also accepted his return, somewhat reserved but without creating obstacles. The dynamic among the three seemed calm. Each had their own routine. Gregory stayed steady in his job in civil projects, Maureen kept her circle of private students, and Elliot looked for job opportunities while readjusting to life in the United States. The house had its silences, but none of them seemed tense. On the contrary, there was a quiet harmony, supported by the maturity of age and the trust built over time. To Gregory, everything seemed in order. He had a stable wife, a present son, a well-kept home, and a pace of life that, though simple, fulfilled him. Nothing suggested anything was wrong. Mornings began with the smell of bacon and eggs, dinners happened over light conversation, and Sundays were reserved for small outings or trips to the neighborhood bookstore. The stability was so constant it started to feel permanent. And precisely because of that, he never imagined what was about to happen. That morning started like so many others. The San Antonio sky was clear, heat already building before 7, and Gregory was getting ready to leave the house with the calm of someone following a well-rehearsed script. He'd slept in the bedroom with Maureen, as always, exchanged a few soft words with her upon waking, and eaten the meal she'd prepared. The smell of waffles lingered in the kitchen when he walked out the door with his briefcase, already thinking about his first appointment of the day. As usual, Maureen stayed behind, tidying dishes and sorting papers scattered across the counter. Gregory got into his car and headed toward the main avenue. Traffic was still light, and he used the brief window to mentally review his day's schedule. But when he stopped at the first red light and reached for his phone to check messages, he noticed his pants pocket felt lighter than usual. He automatically patted it and realized his wallet wasn't there. He frowned, checked the passenger seat, his bag, quickly looked in the center console, nothing. The wallet had been left at home. With a resigned sigh, he turned at the next available spot and drove back along the same streets, unaware that this small detour would completely change his life. As he approached the house, Gregory noticed the front door only slightly ajar, which wasn't unusual when he left in a hurry. He parked in his usual spot, turned off the car, and climbed the porch steps. He pushed the door open casually, already thinking about where he might have left the wallet. He walked in calmly, passed through the hallway toward the bedroom, but as he went by the living room, what he saw froze him completely. The scene in front of him stopped time. On the living room couch, Maureen was sitting with Elliot between her legs. They were kissing. It wasn't a long hug or an ambiguous gesture. It was a full, deep kiss, with no hesitation. Elliot's hands firmly held her waist, and both had their eyes closed, completely unaware of the world around them. Gregory froze for 2 seconds that felt like a century. His heart slammed as if he'd been punched in the chest. The sound that came from his throat was more of a growl than a word, a choked scream that shattered the air and snapped them both back to reality. Maureen jerked back, eyes wide. Elliot pulled away too, instantly pale. Gregory moved forward, unsure whether to yell, hit, or collapse. Thoughts collided in his mind, and instinct took over. He lunged toward his son, wanting to understand, wanting to force answers out with his hands. Elliot, quicker and terrified, jumped back, bumped into the coffee table, and ran toward the door. Gregory tried to reach him, but his body didn't respond fast enough. He chased into the yard, already shouting his son's name, demanding explanations through words heavy with rage. Elliot, sprinting now, grabbed the bike leaning against the side of the garage and disappeared down the street without looking back. Gregory stood on the sidewalk for a few seconds, breathing hard. His muscles trembled, sweat ran down his back, but his whole body felt numb. The world seemed silent. No cars passed. No one on the street. Just him, the morning sun burning his face, and an indescribable pain spreading from the inside out. When he finally got his legs moving again, Gregory went back inside. The house felt different. The same living room, the same furniture, but now every corner carried an invisible stain. Maureen was standing by the couch, hands on her head, eyes red. Gregory walked in without a word. He stopped a few feet from her, staring in silence. There was no more doubt. No room for confusion. No ambiguous interpretation. What remained was raw truth. The woman he'd shared his life with was involved with the boy he'd raised as his son. And that open wound, at that very moment, seemed beyond repair. Gregory stood still, trying to breathe through the chaos as reality collapsed around him. The silence between them lasted only a few seconds, but it felt endless. Gregory stayed frozen, staring at Maureen as if waiting for her to say something, anything that made sense. Maureen, still trembling, gripped her hands tightly, trying to contain the despair spreading across her face. The air in the room felt heavy, as if every breath took effort. She took a hesitant step toward him, but stopped when she saw Gregory instinctively step back. His look wasn't anger anymore, it was ruin. Maureen spoke first. Her voice cracked, low, almost a whisper. She said she didn't know how it started. Said it wasn't planned. That it happened unexpectedly. She talked about loneliness, emptiness, confusing feelings. She tried to explain that Elliot had always been around, that he was attentive, that he listened. That they'd started talking more since his return. That they'd grown closer without realizing it. Gregory couldn't believe what he was hearing. He looked at her as if she were a stranger, as if the words coming from her mouth were part of some delusion. Slowly, his voice grew louder. He asked how she could have the nerve. How she could get involved with someone he raised as a son. How she could hide something so twisted behind a marriage he'd believed was honest. Maureen cried, tried to touch his hand, but Gregory pulled away, shaking his head, lost between disgust, rage, and disbelief. He asked if she'd even thought of him, if she'd considered the pain this would cause. Maureen tried to respond, but her words couldn't hold up. Each excuse sounded more absurd than the last. She said she felt invisible, that she thought Gregory no longer saw her the way he used to, that with Elliot she felt heard, desired. But she couldn't finish a single sentence without being cut off by her husband's look of disgust. Gregory shook his head, muttering incoherently, trying to piece together what he'd just discovered. He said he didn't want to hear any more. That there was no fixing this. That this wasn't a mistake, it was destruction. It was the death of something that had taken years to build. He stepped away and leaned on the kitchen counter, breathing deeply. He said their marriage ended right there. That she needed to accept that. That there would be no second chance, no room for regret. That he wouldn't be able to look at her again without remembering what he'd seen. Maureen broke down, dropped to her knees in the middle of the living room, begging for calm, for time, for one last conversation. But Gregory was firm. He said he'd sleep in the guest room that night and that from then on, she should prepare for the consequences. He went upstairs without looking back. Each step felt like it weighed tons. When he closed the guest room door, he sat on the edge of the bed and stayed there, staring at the floor. From the other side of the house, Maureen's sobs filled the silence. Gregory couldn't cry. He only felt a huge emptiness, a fatigue that seemed to come from his soul. The woman he'd loved for over 20 years, with whom he'd shared days, joys, and silences, had crossed an unforgivable line. And in that moment, he knew nothing would ever be the same. The next morning arrived wrapped in silence. The light slipping through the window slats didn't bring warmth. Gregory woke in the guest room with a stiff body and an exhausted mind, as if he hadn't slept at all. He sat on the edge of the bed for long minutes, elbows on his knees, hands over his face. Every cell in his body seemed to carry the weight of the previous day. Still, something was different in that moment. It wasn't anger anymore. It was a cold determination that left no room for hesitation. He stood up, took a cold shower, and put on the first clean clothes he found. He didn't exchange a single word with Maureen, who was still locked in her room, quietly crying since early morning. Gregory left the house with his phone in hand, eyes fixed on the screen. He'd written down a few lawyer contacts he'd heard about from coworkers. He called one while on his way. He was answered immediately. 2 hours later, he was in the office of a family law attorney. In a neutral voice, he explained the reason for the separation. The lawyer listened quietly, noted the essential details, and explained the process would take time, that there wouldn't be an immediate divorce, but they could start with a petition for legal separation and temporary measures. Gregory signed the first documents, knowing this was only the beginning of a long road. The lawyer warned, the minimum waiting period in Texas is 60 days. But we can speed up the division of assets once there's an agreement. On his way out, Gregory stopped at a restaurant but didn't even touch his silverware. He opened his laptop, connected to the Wi-Fi, and began searching for apartments to rent. He didn't want to stay in that house another month. Every wall seemed to breathe the truth that had been revealed. He messaged real estate agents, saved a few listings, and scheduled viewings for the coming days. He knew moving wouldn't fix everything, but it was a step. The first step. He felt like someone who had just woken from a coma and needed to act before the pain pulled him back under. In the days that followed, Gregory kept his distance. He left early, came home late, avoided any contact. Maureen tried to talk. She waited for him in the living room, left notes on the table, rehearsed conversations that never happened. She cried softly in the hallway when she saw him, but he didn't respond. He walked straight past, as if she were just a faded presence. On the afternoon of the 5th day, when Gregory returned from an apartment visit, he found Elliot sitting on the front garden bench. The young man had a backpack beside him and his eyes down. He looked like he'd been through rough days, but Gregory wasn't moved. He walked through the gate, stopped in front of him, and waited for him to speak. Elliot tried, in a low voice, to start an explanation. He said he hadn't meant to hurt him, that things got out of control, that there was never any intention to cause pain. Gregory just listened, motionless. Each word seemed to come from far away, as if he were hearing it underwater. When Elliot finished, the father took a deep breath and spoke clearly for the first time. He said there was no hatred, but there was disappointment. That he couldn't look at him the same way anymore. That he had broken something that couldn't be fixed. That even though Elliot wasn't his blood, he was his son by choice, by love, by upbringing. And that this betrayal ran deeper than any other. Gregory was firm, direct. He told Elliot he had 1 week to leave the house. It didn't matter where he went, but they needed to go their separate ways. Elliot tried to argue, but the conversation was over. Gregory went inside, locked the door, went upstairs, and isolated himself again. His son's voice still echoed in his ears, but there was no room for doubt anymore. The decision was made. And he knew that, even without shouts or violent actions, this goodbye was final. The 1-week deadline passed without protest. On the 6th day, Elliot packed his few bags into the trunk of a family friend's car and left in silence. Gregory watched from the upstairs window, showing no reaction. There was no farewell, no exchanged glances. It was as if the bond built over years had been completely erased. Elliot was taken in by his late mother's sister, Gregory's deceased wife's sibling, who lived in a nearby town. That's who he stayed in touch with from then on. In the weeks that followed, Gregory received 2 messages on his phone. The first, sent 3 days after Elliot left, was short: "Dad, I'm so sorry. I never meant to destroy you. If you can ever listen, I'd like to explain." The second came on Gregory's birthday, just "Happy Birthday," no signature. Gregory read them, but didn't reply. He deleted the messages and blocked the number. The silence between them, once just distant, became official. There were no more attempts. The bond, once broken, was never rebuilt. Maureen, meanwhile, tried to stay a few more weeks. She still lived in the same house while the divorce process moved through legal channels, but it was like sharing space with a stranger. Gregory avoided any conversation beyond what was necessary. Her presence caused physical discomfort. Every time they passed through the same room, he looked away, kept his lips tight, his body stiff. Maureen, realizing there was no going back, started packing her own bags. She had no family in San Antonio, and the few people she knew were co-workers with whom she wasn't close. Her only viable option was to return to Boston, her hometown. There, she could start over from scratch, even if under the weight of guilt she now carried alone. She left on a cloudy morning, leaving behind the house keys and a note on the table. Gregory never read it. With the house empty, the divorce process underway, and asset division handled by lawyers, Gregory finalized the rental of a modest apartment downtown. It was small, with 2 bedrooms, a narrow living room, and a balcony facing a busy street. But for him, it was enough. The important thing was being far from everything that reminded him of what he'd lost. He took only essential furniture, a few clothes, and personal items that didn't carry heavy memories. The walls were still bare, but already represented a fresh start. In his new routine, Gregory found shelter in discipline. He joined a running group that met 3 times a week at a nearby park. He started going to the gym during lunch breaks, using work intervals to focus on his body and escape his thoughts. He reorganized his project schedule, took on more responsibilities, increased work travel, and filled every part of his day with activities that kept the emptiness from settling in completely. Gradually, the pain stopped being screams and turned into dull, constant noises, still there, but bearable. On weekends, he started visiting a small downtown cafe where he could sit with a book and watch the street. He wasn't looking for company or distractions, just silence. A different kind of silence than before. This one was his, chosen, intentional. He knew he'd lost two people at once. The wife he'd shared 2 decades with, and the son he'd raised from age 2 with dedication and love. This wasn't just a simple loss. It was the demolition of an entire life story. As the months passed, Gregory didn't forget. But he learned not to bend under the weight of memory. He carried scars, yes, but not as burdens. They were signs he had survived. He rediscovered himself in small actions, making his own breakfast, choosing furniture for the new apartment, washing his clothes, taking care of his body, keeping his mind busy. Simple things, but they belonged only to him. Things that carried no one else's shadow. One ordinary afternoon, returning from a run, he stopped in front of the living room mirror and looked at himself calmly. He was thinner, his face more lined, but his eyes were steady. For the first time in a long while, he saw someone who wasn't broken. Not completely. He took a deep breath, closed his eyes for a few seconds, and then smiled, a quiet, almost imperceptible smile. It was the beginning of something. Something that belonged only to him. Something finally at peace. Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss any updates. See you next time.